it's Drybear. And boy, do we need to talk about the Subnautica 2 drama with Krafton and Unknown Worlds. There was a big discovery over the weekend, last week as well. It talks a lot about what's going on in the case. So again, the ever-budding, ever-evolving silliness of this whole debacle has been evolving and growing with time, and today is no different. Now, we've been covering this story as it has been evolving for the last 3 months or so, with tons of different twists and turns in part of that storytelling. So real quick before we jump into the latest news, let's do a recap for the people that aren't caught up. So Unknown Worlds makes Subnautica. They work on other games as well. They work on Below Zero, and they have been working on Subnautica 2, which was planned to launch 2 years ago at the end of 2024. However, 2025 came and went. 2026 is on its way, and so we're wondering, where is Subnautica 2? Well, it was supposed to go out this summer. Didn't happen, and then one day we woke up and the founders of Unknown Worlds, 3 players noted in the lawsuits, have been ejected from the company. And then there was a week of silence. We didn't know what was happening, and then finally we got an update from Krafton, and Krafton is the publisher that Unknown Worlds sold the IP rights and total control of their company over to in 2021, I believe, so quite a while ago. However, Krafton was saying that Subnautica 2 is not ready for early access, and so they prevented Unknown Worlds from shipping it out the door for the summer release that was supposed to happen this year. Now, the founders were not happy about this, and they were very clear to state that this was not an amicable separation, that the founders involved in the lawsuit were fired from the company, without agreement or discussion, and were forced out against their will. So they filed a lawsuit against Krafton claiming breach of contract. Krafton came back and said that no, this had to happen. The founders were bad for the game. They were bad for the company. They weren't doing their job. They weren't showing up to work. They were never in their desk. They were never part of it. And Subnautica 2 would have been so absolutely horrible in the state that it's in internally that no one would have liked it at all. And this is what Krafton was saying. So then we kind of just left it at that and said, okay, fine, let the courts figure out what they're going to do. I'm sure there's going to be a case inside of Korea that gets filed and processed in their normal courts. There's one in Delaware in the United States that is the same thing. And so we've kind of just been in a holding pattern wondering what's going to go on. And while that case has been progressing in the background, they have moved to what's called discovery. Now, again, I am not a lawyer, so this is going to be a very layman's terms representation, but basically the court says, okay, fine, there's enough case here for this to go to trial, and so they're going to take it to trial, and discovery is basically an opportunity for everyone involved in the court case to present evidence, discuss evidence, allow evidence into the official record, or block it for various reasons, X, Y, and Z. And so this is where they start saying, okay, great, we've decided that this is worth having a judge sit on this and oversee it. Let's actually see what evidence there is. And I'm not making this up, but it goes to the first phase of discovery. And so the court says, okay, Krafton has alleged that the founders were bad for business, that they were intentionally trying to ship the game in a bad state that no one was going to enjoy. Prove it. And Krafton says, wait, what do you mean? What do you mean prove it? Even in their official meetings, saying that Krafton feigned astonishment during the parties' meet and confers how it could possibly be part of phase 1, meaning why is the court asking for evidence to be logged in discovery so both sides can see it, that very clearly represents that the game was not ready to launch, that it would have been bad for business, as their response and the official lawsuit alleges that they're going to now have to back up in court. And Krafton is saying, wait, why are you asking for that? They even said that the documents relating to the readiness of the game were irrelevant to the termination, which is what this phase of discovery is focused on, despite this being the reason cited in the termination notices, which was also repeatedly publicly stated in court and in the official filings as well. So Krafton is saying that, hey, the founders were bad for business, they weren't doing their job, and they were also trying to kick the game out the door before it was ready so that they could get a payout of money that they could use for other projects. And Krafton then says that this should just be a given and shouldn't be part of the early stages of discovery, and they're kind of surprised as to why this is relevant at all, even though pretty much most of the things that they've stated in their official responses and their written notices to the court have said that the founders were trying to ship the game too fast and weren't giving it enough time to cook, but now refuse to prove that. Then you have Fortis, which is Fortis Advisors, which is the legal group that is representing the founders, which is kind of helping to promote this and talk about it. Basically, they're saying that the whole point of the founders' termination and why they were ejected from the company in the first place was kind of cruxed on this, the fact that they were lazy, weren't doing their job, and they also were trying to kick the game out without it being finished or being well represented in the public. However, you know, the fact that they're unwilling to show actual evidence of that. The termination notices of the founders gave one reason for their termination, and that was the bad state of Subnautica 2. So if they're not going to show that in court and they're not going to prove it and show that, hey, this actually happened, it kind of has all of the lawyers and even the judge right now very confused as to what Krafton is trying to accomplish. And again, I'm not a lawyer, but I would have to say that if you're someone that is trying to win a court case, if at any point along the way the judge themselves is bewildered by your actions and inability to provide evidence, I feel like that doesn't really go in favor of your whole process here. Now, the founders' lawyers are the ones that say that it's a seismic ship in the case, a little bewildering, but the judge herself, Lori W. Will, says, well, that's something that we definitely need to get to the bottom of today, because that is precisely what was cited as the reason in the answers. The judge is saying, hey, you are being sued for breach of contract. You came back from that lawsuit and said, no, we didn't breach contract. It was the founders that did that, and they did it by, you know, abdication of duty. They weren't actually doing the roles they were supposed to be doing, and then they also weren't even being faithful to the product. They were trying to ship an incomplete game that wasn't fully fleshed out yet, or even fully, you know, represented as an early access title that can be played. So they kind of came out with these big words and shouting from the rooftops that they did something wrong, and now when they're being asked to prove it, they're refusing to. And this whole thing makes it really, really squirrely, to the point that honestly, like, I feel like I was kind of back and forth. I mean, I'm more on the side of just get the game out and let us play it, because I'm more excited to play Subnautica than I am about legal issues and drama and stuff like that. But if Krafton, after coming out this hard, now is saying that, hey, they're going to remove details from the lawsuit, that their response wasn't, I mean, if I would understand like the founders themselves as individuals making messy arguments or failing to submit things to discovery and that sort of thing. But if a multi-billion-dollar company that has a legal team and a business team on staff is making these kinds of mistakes, it kind of puts a lot in question and makes, at least me, and I imagine you, let me know what you think down below, but it makes me feel like they aren't really on the right side of this. There's obviously going to be some he said, she said, they're responsible, no, they did it, that sort of thing. And then ultimately, I just let that kind of get figured out in court. But the fact that they positioned as hard as they did, and now they're backtracking and refusing to provide evidence, is a really big telling moment for them in general. And then when pressed further by the founders' lawyers on why they're just removing the fact that this was part of the lawsuit, the representatives were not clear about why this argument was taken off the table, that the founders tried to kick the game out too early and were just trying to make money. Only that it has been removed from the court case, and that it's no longer why they are saying the founders were terminated. So they're completely backtracking and changing the reason for why things happened after being asked to provide evidence. So the fact that they're just completely 180ing and saying we're not going to provide evidence, just don't worry about it, that at least, you know, out from the outside perspective, to me, that seems like, hey, you're mega guilty. You know you don't have evidence, or if you do, it's really weak and isn't going to convince anybody. So you're just deciding to abandon it entirely and go to the next tactic, rather than it being like the argument of someone who's in the right and did everything by the book. Having this kind of squirrely attitude is very, very scary. Now, it could be that Krafton's lawyers are saying, you know, we probably are not going to be able to convince you know, a jury or at least the gaming community that the game wasn't ready, because Subnautica 1 and Below Zero both launched in a very early access state with bare bones functionality, and most of them were retconned or changed throughout the early access process. And so you probably would have a hard time convincing people that the Subnautica 2 was so horrendous, so awful, so terrible that people that loved the franchise and wanted to experience like multiplayer and exploring the new mechanics and seeing some of the new wildlife, even though the story's not done and the biomes aren't all in and the content isn't all there, I feel like it would, maybe they're just saying that, hey, we're going to give up and this isn't going to be an argument that we want to do. However, it does seem really fishy that they decided to back up from that. So now, instead of saying that Subnautica 2 wasn't ready, they're just ignoring that topic in general. They're now instead focusing on the argument that the founders abandoned their posts and deceived their employer. Causing more confusion is the accusation that the founders downloaded files and kept devices with confidential information on them. We talked about this a couple weeks ago when we covered the latest update on this. Krafton was saying that the founders, you know, when they knew they were going to be fired, they went to their desk and started hackermans downloading all kinds of illegal files. They didn't mention what the distribution of file types was. Like, they said it was like 100,000 files that they downloaded, but was that like, you know, 99,500 email text files, like they're downloading their inbox so that they can see correspondence and defend themselves in court? Or were they downloading like actual like perforce or, you know, version control branches down from the game files and holding on to copyrighted information or copyrighted assets that are part of the game itself? They weren't clear on that in general, but now they're doubling down on that as well. And this only came after the termination that they decided to mention this. They just fired them one day with no explanation, no detail, and it took weeks to months before we actually got an explanation as to why they were being fired. And even now, they're just trying to paint the founders in a bad light. Now, this next part is kind of interesting. So this is kind of like getting into, since they're in, you know, the first phase of discovery, the judge is now part of this and they have official records and that stuff. So we can see kind of where the deliberation is going. However, an interesting fact here, the judge is already confused by Krafton, you know, backtracking and removing arguments out of the blue only when they're asked for evidence, but not as part of the initial phase of like, why is this case being brought to court in general. However, Krafton still maintains that they are justified in their termination, even though they're now no longer saying that the game wasn't ready, which then if they're backtracking on that and deciding not to include any details or any like actual proof of this, it kind of leaves everyone to say, okay, well, if Krafton is backtracking and saying that the game was not, you know, it wasn't so bad that it couldn't be shipped, does that mean that the game was ready? Like, if they can't prove that other way and they're not trying to argue it anymore, does that mean that the game was perfectly ready and everything was fine and Krafton just wanted something else to go on, or they were just unhappy with the founders and wanted to make some changes in general? So they say that the termination is justified, and they filed a motion to inspect the founders' devices. This is when the founders were getting fired. They were officially propositioned by Krafton saying, hey, give us your phones, give us your tablets, give us your laptops, give us your desktops, anything that you have at home, hand over every device in your possession so that we can check them to see that you don't have anything bad on there. And the founders said, no, we're not going to give you our personal devices. We're just not going to do that. And so Krafton was pretty pissed about that, and they wanted to get back from them, but that was their whole point. However, the founders, now they're moved to discovery, contend and mention to the court that their perspective on this is that they had a right to those documents and devices, that they, you know, didn't have to give them up as part of that, especially if both parties knew this was going to go to litigation. And at the motion is too invasive, meaning that why does Krafton have the right to relegate and take all of their personal devices and manually sift through their personal devices to make sure that whatever Krafton deems is unworthy gets deleted of their own accord? I mean, you can imagine if you were leaving a company that you'd worked at a long time and they wanted to, you know, grab all your personal items and go through them. That does feel very invasive. But to the surprise of everyone here, to the latter point, the judge agreed. The judge actually said, yes, that is quite invasive. And at least from, you know, and this isn't like an official ruling, but the judge agreed, at least in discussions, that the idea of Krafton having control over all of their personal devices is invasive, and they don't really have the right to do that. And it gets worse from there. So if you've been following along in this drama, we know that throughout the process, Krafton has said repeatedly that employees at Unknown Worlds have official statements. Like they said, like an unnamed employee from Unknown Worlds says that the founders weren't doing their job. They were just figureheads. They weren't really involved in the development at all. And then they refuse to name that person, and that person isn't been brought into evidence, and no actually official testimony has been brought forward to the court. And so the judge is starting to get frustrated with them as well, because when asked to present these things that they've mentioned in their official response to the court, they haven't been providing them. So Fort has also alleged that Krafton hasn't been playing ball, so it's kind of a subjective perspective there, pushing back against some of its requests for discovery and refusing to confer. Krafton is only willing to provide data from 2 people high up in the company rather than employees who were on the ground. And so this isn't just like a pointing fingers thing. Krafton themselves put in at least 3, 4, 5 times in their responses that they have individual producers, publishers, people at Unknown Worlds, actual developers on the project. They have mentioned many times that they have, actual testimony from people in the company that are saying all these bad things about the founders. But once again, when asked to present that evidence to the court, they're either fighting back, being very resistant, refusing to do so, asking for extremely long timelines, like, hey, we'll get it to you in 6 months kind of thing, like really long timelines. And so not only is the court, the judge, and the lawyers representing the founders getting frustrated, but it just seems frustrating from the outside as well, that they're kind of just giving them the runaround instead of just saying, hey, if you guys are in the right, why not just provide the evidence that you are? Even going as far to say is that they will only provide correspondence as part of their history and interaction with Unknown Worlds between them and Krafton. Krafton is saying they'll only provide correspondence if it includes both termination and earnout in the same context, meaning it has to be related to them being terminated, so in anything involving them being fired, and also anything being involved with the payout that they were supposed to get for the end of this year for the money they were going to make on Subnautica 2, and they would provide nothing else. So like if it was individually one of those 2 topics, or it was something that was related but a different topic entirely, Krafton's saying, nope, you can't have that. That correspondence isn't part of this case. What's interesting is this little note here as well. Like the judge just, it seems like the judge is kind of in favor of, at least the defendants here, or I guess they would be the founders in general. But she also mentions that it sounds like a really terrible email for someone to write that includes both the earnout and the termination in a single context. And she says it's hard for me to imagine that it'd be that blunt about it. But I think the crucial word to focus on here is imagine. It's because Krafton is being so obtuse about providing evidence that most of the court involved in this process has to imagine what it is they're talking about, right? So if Krafton's refusing to provide, adequate actual representation and proof of what they're talking about, it may exist, right? And that's what the judge is saying here. She's being impartial and saying, hey, it may exist, but if you're refusing to provide it, all we have to go on is imagination. And these grand claims you're making, they're hard. She's saying they're hard for her to imagine them existing in the exact way that Krafton has alleged. But that is the update for today. Basically, Krafton being very sticky and kind of reductive and refusing to play ball and cooperate in the court case in general, and also just completely backtracking on accusations and pointed arguments against the founders, just seemingly out of the blue, and moving on to something else, which kind of gives the feeling that they're trying to win the case rather than trying to be right. They just want to win, and that's it. So whatever technicality allows them to do that. But let me know what you think. Like, are you still kind of waiting for things to play out? Were you someone who was on the side of Krafton up until now, and now this kind of throws that into the wrench into the plans? Or are you someone that's always been on the side of the founders and finally feeling like there might be some vindication on the way, considering how upfront the founders are being and how difficult Krafton is being? Let me know in the comments down below. If you found value in today's video, leave a like down below, leave a comment for the algorithm to help this video get seen by more people, and don't forget to check out my other channels for other content and other stuff and other things.